So today we're going to start looking at the beginning of the Civil War. Not the whole war, just the beginning and what really started it. And let's review some of the things we've been talking about causes leading up to the Civil War over the last couple of weeks. One of the major issues was the idea and the issue of slavery, whether or not states would allow slavery to be in the Union, and which states could have slavery, and what you would do about new states being admitted into the Union. So at the time, they had come up with the Missouri Compromise that basically would say states north of Missouri that were admitted to the Union would not allow slavery, but states south of Missouri admitted to the Union would allow slavery. But then there were a few new states that didn't follow those rules. So it caused some problems, and people started to really look to the government as to whether or not slavery should be allowed across the entire United States instead of just leaving it up to the states. However, that posed new problems. Should states be allowed to decide if slavery is allowed? Should states be allowed to make their own rules and create their own taxes, raise their own funds, or raise their own armies? And so they argued over the issue of states' rights. And it finally came to a boiling point during the election of 1860. That was our last lesson that we did. And Lincoln won with the majority of the votes, even though it was only 40% of the votes, because the South split them. So if you look back at this map and you can remember, the northern states had a higher population as it was anyway. And if the South had all voted together, their candidate would have won, but they were split between three candidates. So Lincoln ends up winning, and he is openly against slavery. And so immediately, many southern states feared the worst and feared that slavery would be abolished under this new president. And so they started seceding from the Union. That means leaving the Union, trying to form their own independent country or state. So the southern states, like I said, they feared he was going to abolish it, and they argued that they had the right to leave the Union because of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. It talks about states having the rights to make decisions for themselves, and they said they had voluntarily joined the Union, so therefore they could voluntarily leave the Union. If it was something they chose to be a part of, they could also choose to leave. And South Carolina was the first state to do this. They left the Union on December 20th, 1860, before Lincoln was even inaugurated. It was about a month after the election, and they decided they had had enough. They put out this newspaper that says this union is dissolved, and it's basically like their Declaration of Independence. So 11 southern states seceded from the Union, and they called themselves the Confederate States of America. And so it first started with 7 states: South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. And these states formed the Confederate States of America. They're the ones that came up with the title. This was before Lincoln had even actually taken office, before he had become the official president. He was voted in but had not been inaugurated. And then shortly after he was inaugurated, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina also seceded. So there ended up being a total of 11 southern states that seceded, and they called themselves the Confederate States of America. And they chose Jefferson Davis to be their president. That's this gentleman here. He actually has a very strong resemblance to Lincoln as well. And they wrote a new constitution for themselves that had a lot of similarities to the United States Constitution, but a major part of it was that slavery would be legal in their country, that you could not abolish slavery. Any state could choose to be a slave state. Their capital was located in Montgomery, Alabama. And this is how the Union was actually divided during the middle of the war. So as of 1863, these red states here are free states that have abolished slavery. The blue states are the slave states that have seceded from the Union. And then the gray states are slave states, but they had chosen to remain in the Union. So not all slave states decided to leave. So officially, the war begins at Fort Sumter, which was a Union fort in Charleston, South Carolina. It didn't have a whole lot of protection at the time anyway, because it never felt like it was needed. And Lincoln announces that he's going to resupply the fort. And obviously, that worries people in the South, especially in that area. Why is Lincoln choosing to resupply a fort that's not needed if we're not at war? And he was really taking precautionary measures, knowing that states were seceding from the Union. He wasn't quite sure what was going to happen. But by announcing that he was going to resupply the fort, it kind of was a self fulfilling prophecy, in that the South then chose to attack. So the Confederate general P.G.T. Beauregard led the attack on Fort Sumter on April 12th, 1861. So at this point, Lincoln's inauguration took place in January, so he had only been really in office for a few months when war broke out. And the Union did their best to defend the fort, but they really struggled. They didn't have all the supplies needed. There weren't that many people there, and this battle lasted for 34 hours. But ultimately, they lost. Fort Sumter was actually an island, as you can see in this picture. So they were kind of surrounded with no way out and nowhere to go. It's not like you could retreat. You would be killed or drowned. So the South then took over the fort and they occupied it for 4 years, almost till the end of the Civil War. And this was the official first battle of the Civil War. So during the Civil War, the North and the South both had advantages and disadvantages. But right now, we're just going to look at some of the advantages. In the North, as I've already said, the North had many more people. They had a higher population, so therefore they had access to more resources. They often had more money due to factories being located in the North. And these factories could also be used to make weapons. So the South primarily focused on plantations and farming. They were more of an agricultural part of the country. And the North focused on factories, which was bringing in a lot of money and the resources needed to make weapons and ammunition. They also, with more people, you can create larger armies. They also had many more miles of railroad tracks, which means they could transport their people and their weapons greater distances faster than the South could. The South's main advantage was that most of the battles were being fought in the South. So they were fighting on home ground. They had the home field advantage. They knew their territory, they knew the terrain that they were fighting on, and the Northern soldiers did not know this. That also means they were closer to their supplies. As the North was fighting in the South, if they needed more guns or anything, they had to get it shipped in from up north. And the South didn't have to worry about that. They also wanted to fight harder because they were protecting their own homes, protecting their livelihood, and protecting the communities they were in. And Southern soldiers were better equipped with skills necessary to survive a war. They were kind of the rough and tough crowd, and not the city folk from up north. And so the Southern soldiers were better prepared to fight. They had more experience in that area. So basically, this leads to a civil war that would last for 4 more years. It forever changed the country, and it pit Lincoln and Davis against each other until Lincoln's death. So that is the end of our notes of how the Civil War began. In our next lesson, not next week, so it's spring break, but the week after that, we'll talk about some of the major battles of the Civil War.